Hello and welcome to EMS Research with Professor Bram, where we talk about the issues related to those who work in emergency medical services. Today, we'll be talking about jumping calls in rural EMS. Welcome to EMS Research Vlog and Podcast here from the studio in Houston, Texas. I'm your host, Bram Duffy. I'm a full-time paramedic working in EMS just like many of you. I also have an appointment as an assistant professor of communication at Kennesaw State University and also a research fellow with Fielding Graduate University. And so I actually have a research study open now for first responders. So if you don't mind being interviewed by me, go ahead to my website at professorbram.com. It's professorbram.com, and you can check out more about the show and also click the research tab to apply. Before we get started, I want to tell you that I've written 2 books on communication, and the most recent book has been just released called Hypnotic Communication in Emergency Medical Settings for Life-Saving and Therapeutic Outcomes. You can find a link below, or I'll be talking more about it near the end of the show so you can see what's up. Today, I'm excited to tell you that I'm here to interview Latimer Hoke, and he's a first responder and educator. And first, I just want to tell you some stuff about him before he pops on with us. Latimer Hoke is an accomplished professional with lots of cool background stuff that's really helped us find him quickly. And so he has recently put out an article that we're going to talk about today. And he works in Vermont and Montana since 2009 and has experience working with ambulance services, doing stuff like search and rescue missions and aiding ski patrols, and also operating within a dispatch center. In addition to the EMS roles, he also has a history of teaching English and healthcare subjects to public school students, and then also coaching long distance running. So it's pretty cool. He has a bachelor's degree in secondary English and a master's degree in education leadership, and has qualifications like senior alpine certification from the National Ski Patrol and advanced EMT certification with the National Registry. So all this stuff made him a well-rounded person to be able to get to interview for this. And I'm excited to have you on the show today. I'll tell you, finding an article like that you wrote really touched me pretty quickly because I have a history in rural EMS. Latimer, you wrote an article in a Journal of Emergency Medical Services called Not Truly Off Duty, True First Responders in Rural Areas. And I just want to welcome you to the show and ask you about what made you put this article together.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Well, a few pieces kind of brought this article together. My undergraduate degree is in English teaching, so I just enjoy writing. I've worked as a journalist and a newspaper editor, which was a super cool job. And I've written a book that isn't published yet, and I'd heard that if you publish other things, it can make it easier to publish a book. So I thought, okay, well, what can I offer? Where can I publish? I saw that you could just submit things to GEMS unsolicited, and the first thing I submitted was a total flop. And then this one was accepted for peer review, which was a really interesting experience. And so now I just moved back to Vermont from Montana in January, and the ambulance service that serves the town I live in didn't have a first responder program. They'd kind of shut it down. And then they were trying to resurrect it and think about, what kind of guidelines they might want. And I thought, well, okay, maybe I'll just write something and maybe I'll give it to the chief and he can just do whatever he wants with it. But then I kind of had it that I thought polished enough to share with a larger audience, sent it off to GEMS and went through their process. And there it is.
Well, thank you for doing that. I think that you spoke for a lot of people. And so what your article was about, it was about what it's like being in a rural part of the country where you don't have as many ambulance services around. Now, you may have somebody who has medical training that could get to the person in an emergency, but getting the actual ambulance there may not be as fast. And so the first thing that comes to my mind is that I have like this back and forth that goes on in my mind because, when I worked in the rural part of the country, resources were so tight that if someone were to come on scene, or we would be able to get help from, a crew member that's off duty or a nurse that we know, that it would be golden, and we'd be, excited to see them. And when I work in the city, it's kind of the opposite, and so it's sort of like different ways of looking at EMS, because in the city, we would call someone a woo-woo. Have you ever heard that term before? So it basically means like someone who is overly enthralled with their job in EMS to the point where, they would carry their EMS bag with them everywhere they go. Definitely it's in their car. They have their radio on their side. They definitely keep the t-shirt on, and, like it's just nutso. And the other thing that I guess that used to label that funny word was with people who would carry the Batman belts with too many things on the side. And so, in the city, I'm like, ha ha, that's kind of funny. But when I work in the rural area, I'm like, gosh, I need all that Inspector Gadget gear because I'm alone. I may not have any kind of help. So I just think that the economy is kind of interesting. And before we get going too much further, I have to also mention that when we talk about jumping calls, when we talk about, getting to the patient in an emergency and doing whatever it takes to get there fastest, the first thing I thought when I read this article was about Mother Jugs and Speed. Have you seen the movie?
I haven't seen
You
the whole
haven't?
movie.
Okay, so for those who haven't, please do, because it's a 1970s comedy that has some top actors in it, and they really have two competing ambulance services in the area. And so if they find out one's going on a call, then they'll try to jump it, because they can get there first and get the patient first. And so I also worked in a rural part of the country where that was the case. We had competing ambulance services, and so even though you weren't supposed to, like sometimes people would, technically, get to the call sooner. But, so there's sort of like this city versus country kind of, thing that goes on my head when we talk about this topic. But how has this been received by the people in your area? And I'm assuming that most of the folks that have been able to give you feedback on the article have been from the rural area. But tell me more about what folks have given you for feedback on your article.
Right before we went live with our revived first responder program or jumper program here at the one service, and I work for two services. They're equidistant from my house. Basically, I turn left out of the driveway and work for one service, turn right, work for the other. And so now I could jump calls for either service. And that was kind of my goal, is like, hey, if my neighbor needs help,
Right.
I'd like to know about it and go help them. So I shared it with both services. I shared it with another ambulance service. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of people didn't read it, but people who did read it gave me positive feedback. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool, because the effect of the peer review process is that your writing has to become more professional, which I call boring. So it's not as interesting as I would usually write. And it's like, oh, it was a good article. I'm like, well, okay, I thought it was boring, knowing what the draft one was. But then I think the funniest piece is I didn't tell my family I published anything. And my brother's a flight nurse. And he calls me up. He's like, hey, my coworkers just told me that you published an article. And I was like, oh, yeah, well, that's a thing. So, yeah, I guess, at least locally in northern Vermont, people have read it. I don't know anything beyond that.
Well, I think it's awesome. And so what I want to ask about is what's the environment like there locally? So if I have an emergency, maybe it would be kind of scary to have strangers starting to knock on the door to my house. There's a trust thing that I would think that isn't there as much, because you don't have the actual ambulance showing up with people in uniform. You just have people running, to your side. So how does that feel? How does that work out in practical terms?
Well, I mean, for starters, well, and just, yeah, for context, I mean, if you think about fire departments, the vast majority of the area of the United States is served by volunteer fire departments. I'm not sure about the majority of the population. I know it's like an 80-20 split between urban rural, with 80% urban-ish, 20% rural-ish population. In rural areas, yeah, like all the fire departments basically are volunteer, right? And so that's actually a normal thing for, I think, for most people to understand that there are people with red lights on their personal vehicles that go and just do things, literally drop what they're doing and go and help. And in a small town, if you don't know someone who's on the volunteer fire department, you know someone who knows them, right? It's like at most 2 degrees of separation.
Yeah, because I guess I lived in the city too long. Because I grew up in the rural part of the country, so I need this I need this reminder. I need to remember that everybody knows everybody. So that makes this stuff even more personal, because this could be, it's definitely someone that that you could be there to help. And I'm imagining in the city, or the suburbs, this same kind of situation may not be as welcome to me. I would just see all these folks, running to help. We have ways that we can help each other out, especially in the rural parts of the country. There's just no ambulances in some places. So this is something that's going to help for a little bit, I guess. But in your area, for example, do you think there's going to be a longer term fix in the horizon to be able to have more ambulances so that less call jumping is necessary?
Just the nature of this, I don't think it's going to go away. So because so the 2 ambulances I work for, they're each a 10-minute normal flow of traffic drive from my house. Like, okay, let's say we, each place they staff 1 ambulance at a time. They have an extra ambulance that, maybe we could pull a crew together for a backup crew, backup call or something. And I mean, regardless, if my neighbor needs help, I will be there 10 minutes faster than an ambulance, even if the station was staffed with 2 ambulances, 2 full crews, right? So rural areas are so sparsely populated that's just not going to be practical to have ambulances that, could hit like an 8-minute response time target to every place. And so I think, yeah, there's going to be a lot of, I think it's a feature of rural EMS, is that people sometimes will meet the ambulance on scene to form a full crew, or they'll just go and join the ambulance crew. I mean, we have at one service, we have our director is a paramedic, and she just loves EMS, and she, if she's around, she's listening. Maybe there's a BLS crew on duty that day, and she's listening. Hey, if there's a call, she'll drive 10 miles and go meet the ambulance and do paramedic stuff.
It's good to have people that are that are serious about helping the community, because, gosh, we really need it. And I'm just thinking about all these different dynamics that are in play, especially in the rural area. And so, what if, like, helicopter stuff, for example, does that play much in? Like, if a jumper could get to the patient, would that person be affiliated with the department so that they could authorize the dispatch of a helicopter?
I've taken mutual aid calls where it's taken me over half an hour to get to the scene, and that's in Vermont. In Montana, we had primary service area that was an hour drive away, and then an hour and a half or 2 hours back to the hospital. So in Montana, we called helicopters a lot, and yeah, anyone who got there and said, yeah, it seems like we need a helicopter, yeah, they launch.
Yeah, I'm just thinking what, whatever options you have sometimes. And so the other things that you brought up is in the article, talk about what it's like if you have a paid versus volunteer service and how this would work. Because I guess, if you need an overtime for Christmas, you could just assign yourself to all the calls, if it is unrestricted. That was one of the things that you had mentioned, was that this has to be monitored, because of the safe driving part, but also like HR things. So what's the best way that you see this kind of system playing out?
So yeah, one service is primarily, well, I guess they're both hybrid departments, volunteer and paid. And so if you're a volunteer, I'm going to say volunteer employee. I mean, like, you get covered by workers' compensation and everything if you get wrecked on the job. But so if you're a volunteer, like, you can just go on calls and, like, there's no problem there. But if you're paid, you can't volunteer and get paid to do the same work for the same company. And that's a federal rule, which I find kind of annoying, but it is what it is. And yeah, like if I've already hit like, let's say I hit 40 hours for a week at one service, or if it's 80 hours for 2 weeks, whatever the pay schedule is. Um, and then I'm just like, let's say I was really enthusiastic and I'm just trying to go on every single call I possibly can. There'd probably be some people who are annoyed and saying like, the itchy feet call, I don't think you needed to drop what you were doing and go to that.
Right.
But, um, it could become an issue because yeah, now you have to get paid and then document it in your time clock, your time card, all of that stuff. So yeah, I think people do need to be aware of that. If they're in a rural area and they're like, yeah, I guess we could have people use their private vehicles and just, get a jump on things and take care of a patient, but you do need to make sure you're hitting all of those, legal pay requirements. One service I worked for, I got right when I started, maybe like a couple months in, they ended up with a huge back pay thing because people were always trying to figure out creative ways to not pay EMS workers. And so I got like $50 of back pay. I mean, some people got thousands, but you really want to avoid that and just do it right the first time.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking about the gear that folks bring with them. I'm assuming that most gear is going to be assigned by the department, and it's a lot of stuff to be responsible for. As a paramedic, my favorite thing to have is that heart monitor, so I can just imagine the horror of losing that thing. And so how do you know how the EMS physicians think about this, or do they have you seen anything about their oversight? Because really it's a benefit to the community, but like you're pointing out in your article, there are oversight concerns.
It sounds like our state level medical direction would love it if, I mean, first response or jumping calls, that's a reality that they're aware of and they accept, and I think they encourage that, especially for like higher acuity things like, if someone cuts themselves with a chainsaw, they're going to need
Oh,
proper bleeding control very quickly. And they would also love it if basically everyone's driving around with defibrillators in their cars. But then that gets expensive and annoying, and like, oh, I got to bring it in the winter and in the summer because I can't have things baking in the hot car. I can't have them freeze. So there's maybe like 3 weeks a year that you can just leave things in your car overnight.
yeah.
So one service is kind of okay with people carrying some advanced level medications, IV supplies. My hometown service, everyone was issued an ALS bag, and it was your responsibility to keep track of expiration dates and stuff. And then this other service that like just resurrected their program, they've said BLS only until an ambulance shows up. And then if you're an ALS provider, you can, grab stuff off the ambulance and help. And I was thinking about it, I was like, man, I do have a lot of stuff in my car, but it's pretty rare that I make it beyond the pen and the notepad,
Yeah.
right? If I'm just there 10 minutes before an ambulance, I'm going to get a medical history and maybe I'll get a full set of vitals. And I've first responded, jumped to whatever, hundreds of calls now at this point, and only a handful of times have I maybe done a nebulizer, given aspirin, started an IV before the ambulance showed up. So,
But I bet those times actually mattered. That's why you were doing those tasks. So gosh, one of the things that you mentioned when we were talking before of the show was sort of one of your pet peeves was the emergency driving. And I think that it's something that's really difficult to get out of the EMS blood, is wanting to show up emergency. And I'll tell you that I have seen very real patients die of nosebleeds. So when we talk about things that sometimes sound so insignificant, I guess it's those 1 in 100 cases that we're doing it. But tell me more about your take, because research study after research study has shown that driving lights and sirens does not help in the end. So I personally think it's situational, but I know this is one of your pet peeves. So tell me what your thoughts are.
all right. So I'll just say that if I had to be all or nothing about it, I would say we would just get rid of the lights. But like, I'm not an absolutist. Just I know the data says that like almost never does it help the long-term outcome of the patient. Um, but there are some cases where, yeah, it's like it's a big deal. Yeah, I mean, I'm with this on it being situational. Um, like one of the so here's an interesting thing. I don't know if this would happen in a city. One service I work for, the first ambulance is out on a call, and the second ambulance is out for maintenance. So, and then we get a call for a hospice patient who just needs lifting assistance from their regular bed to their new hospital bed that just got delivered. Not a big deal. And I think like 5 of us went to this call just in our personal vehicles. We didn't call for mutual aid, didn't call for an ambulance because we're like, that's pretty cut and dry on what we're going to be doing. And as I recall, at least 2 of the 5 of us kind of drove like idiots, lights and sirens, 60 and a 25 through the center of town to get to
Everybody's
this thing.
racing everybody else.
Yeah, I'm
Everybody's
like,
all speed racing.
we could like get there in half an hour. We could give this an hour or 2 and the situation is not going to change. We don't need lights to go to this. So I really think that flow of traffic responses should be way more normal. And that doesn't mean that we're taking a lackadaisical approach to the call. It just means like, okay, a call comes in, we get our butts in gear, we get in the ambulance or our vehicle, and we get the wheels rolling basically as soon as we can. And study after study, I think the biggest time savings I've seen on an average over a system is like 4 minutes time savings. And that's the best numbers. Like the normal numbers are like 2 minutes of time savings. So, how often does 2 minutes really matter? And then, the other stuff that drives me crazy is like, oh yeah, that call sounds boring or lame. Okay. I'm going to go use the bathroom first. I'm going to finish my sandwich and then I'm going to mosey out to the ambulance. And then I'm going to drive like an idiot with my lights and sirens. Like you could have saved way more time by just being efficient with your movements rather than being dangerous with the driving. So,
Yeah. Can I just share with you? When I used to work with this paramedic, his name was Mark Boyd, and he lives in Missouri now. And I believe he's a minister and he stopped being a paramedic, but he's a very large man. And he, in my opinion, was a really good paramedic, one of the first paramedics that I worked with in my career. And that was his philosophy. He said that the biggest time killer was getting to the truck. And so what I noticed was that, if the alarm went off, you would have this man barreling down the hall, busting down doors to get to that ambulance. And it's funny because he'd beat everybody. He would, and so I think that, because of his size, he was sort of like wanting to prove that nobody's going to have one up on me. And he did it really well, but he also drove fast. But the point that he made well was that it's time to get your bed up and get in gear. And when I precept new EMTs or when I have students that come ride with me on the ambulance, that's the first thing I tell them. I say that it's important for you to make sure your bladder's always empty all the time. So we can't get into a spot where you have to go to the bathroom because you may not. And thinking about those extra pieces really matter. The other thing that I guess we haven't really mentioned is what the public thinks about all this. And I think that from the public standpoint, I'm just imagining that we have a person who doesn't really know much about emergency medicine that's scared, so that fear is what's driving oh my gosh, get somebody here faster to take over, to deal with this, to make sure that everything's okay. And I'm going to just give a shout out to my dispatch friends right now and say that this might be an opportunity, depending on the system, for the dispatcher to be able to do that time on the phone that would keep the situation calm, and I know that right now the orientation for dispatch is getting information and getting people there. And I know that many dispatch systems give instructions, but what I don't think that what I have not seen are opportunities for the dispatcher to sort of switch direction and then focus on the scene management. So tell me more about your thoughts on that.
So Vermont is lucky. I mean, and let's be real, the population of Vermont is like a large music festival, right? There's like 650,000 people who live here. So it's not a huge population. And but statewide, if you call 911, every 911 call taker has the same training, and they're trained in emergency medical, like pre-arrival instructions, same for law enforcement and fire. And medical calls in particular, the 911 call taker owns that call until more help gets there. It doesn't matter where in the state you are, like whoever answers that call, they're with you on the phone, giving you instructions and advice and comfort, until the flashing lights show up. I've been impressed with the instructions that people have had before I show up with an ambulance or in my car. You know, they've got their medication list ready. If they're having trouble breathing, they've ditched their tight-fitting clothing. They've put the dog away. I
No,
mean,
they didn't. They never put the dog away from me. I
I mean,
love dogs too, but they never put them away from me.
It's not a universal, but I have, you know, it's however much time they have to give instructions. They're like, okay, well, what's the next thing we can deal with? Oh, is your car in the way? Like, are they going to be able to get in? You know, the longer it is, the more questions they ask, and the you know, more instructions they give, so that people stay calm. Because if they have something to do, they're a lot calmer.
Well, it's fun to think about because, you know, that's not a world that I live in. I just sort of touch base with dispatch from time to time, and it's a lot of intensity. And so I know that the high volume 911 systems don't stay on the phone necessarily the whole time, you know, and so I think it's situational with them. This is
Yeah.
this is great stuff. But before we get going, do you have anything else that you want to add or mention to our talk?
I mean, I could go on for days about this stuff, but when you're talking about like uniforms and professionalism, stuff like that, it's so interesting because, like, yeah, in a city, if someone's not wearing the uniform, who are you? Get out of my face! I don't trust you.
Right.
But what I've found in rural areas is if you just show up, I mean, and you got some bag that's semi-reflective, and you know, you kind of look like you know what you're doing. My experience has been that if you show up, I mean, they've called, so they're expecting someone to show up, um, and if you're calm, you introduce yourself, and you explain, hey, I'm just here before an ambulance. The ambulance is on the way, and let's see what we can do to help in the meantime. I have found that it doesn't matter at all what I'm wearing. Like, to the point of being ridiculous sometimes. I have gone to so many calls. It was like I had this shirt that was jinxed. I'd be out doing yard work in this shirt that said University of Vermont Naked Bike Ride. And I'd get so many calls when I was wearing that shirt. And I'd go. And I went to a construction zone once with a canoe on the roof of my car, and I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt and sandals because I was planning to go canoeing.
Yeah.
And the guys in the construction zone weren't like, who's this joker? They were like, oh, thank you for coming to help our coworker. Mm-hmm. And the weirdest one, I was on a long distance bike ride in Utah. It was like a 10-day bike trip, and with a couple other friends, and I ended up being the first responder to a motorcycle crash. And I'm wearing, this is a great image, I'm wearing spandex shorts, spandex shirt, and a red bandana on my head. And I'm in control of this scene for a good 20 minutes before the nearest anyone shows up, from Wyoming, because we were close to the state line. And so, you know, advanced EMT shows up, and I'm like, oh, thank goodness I can leave. And he just like keeps deferring to me.
Well, you already got there. You already made contact. I understand, right?
And I'm like, I'm just some guy on a bicycle. Like, he doesn't know who I am. But I guess there was something about how I was just communicating and behaving that sent signals that, like, this is okay, and I know what's going on, and I know what to do. And if you're sending those signals, the clothing doesn't matter. Um, and I think, especially in a rural area, right? It's going to be sometimes an hour before an actual ambulance shows up.
Yeah.
Beggars can't be choosers.
Yeah. And when I'm in a more rural area, I do have a feeling that I need to stop at a car wreck, or I have a feeling that I need to, because I understand that the environment is different. But if I'm in the city, the chances that I'm going to stop are pretty low. And some of it is because I've been on the other side of that. I've been the 911 responder who felt like that these folks were in my way, kind of. And part of it is this time that we have difference. So in the city, we're looking at 4 to 8 minutes of a response, and in the rural area, it just doesn't happen that way. What was it, like country mouse versus city mouse? Wasn't there something? Wasn't there something like that about? But when I leave the house, I pretty much, I'm a Boy Scout. So I pretty much have my uniform tucked in, ready to go, like, prim and proper on all my calls, ready to go. But when I worked in one of the rural parts of the country, I wore a jumpsuit. And I remember that one time I was in the shower and I got a 911 call for a CPR, and I had to get in that jumpsuit while I was still wet, emergency style, and I almost killed myself, but I made it out. I still even remember the whole call, and it was like 15 years, 20 years ago. And I made it out to the scene, and I remember that I was still wet, underneath that suit. And so it's like whatever it takes attitude. And it's there's also a little bit more of like a superhero feel to the job when you're the only person available, only person out there, and it makes the job have a different level of responsibility because you're it sometimes. I appreciate being able to talk to you about this, and I think it's really cool. So, first thinking about jumping calls was just about woo woo or mother jugs and speed kind of thing, and now for those of us who don't live in the rural area, it's important to see that the only help that your neighbors might get is your help. And so having an EMT after your name or an RN after your name has a different level of responsibility in the rural areas. And so I appreciate your work and your approach to this. And Latimer, thanks for being with me on the show today.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It's great to have a bigger platform to celebrate rural EMS.
So I want to also invite you to check out my latest book. I co-authored the book with 4 Arrows, who has 2 doctorates and is an expert on indigenous scholarship and hypnosis. So I just want to invite you to check it out because we introduce a method for communicating with patients on the scene of an emergency that takes advantage of some of the properties found in hypnosis. And so, especially in a rural environment where you have nobody coming for a while, it's good to have some background on what to say and how to talk to these patients. The book is called Hypnotic Communication in Emergency Medical Settings for Life-Saving and Therapeutic Outcomes. You can follow the link below or find it pretty much anywhere that books are sold. If you contact me with a proof or a message about your order, I'll be happy to mail you an autograph sticker. It's kind of like a design thing to put in the jacket cover. I'm doing that because I have friends that are mailing me books, and there's no need for you to mail me your book if you want me to autograph it. I'll get a sticker off to you. I'm also doing a research project related to first responders who live in the United States, and I could really use your help if you don't mind being interviewed by me. It takes about an hour, and it's over a video call. So just go to my website and fill out the form at professorbram.com, professorbram.com. And I just want to say thank you again for listening. I look forward to sharing more insights with you in this next episode. And so if you enjoyed EMS research, please tell your friends, like, share, and subscribe to help others get the message. And then to check out what we looked at, stay tuned for the credits at the end. Thanks.